We have to interrupt the previously scheduled programming because we have just gotten a hotfix. To be fair, we're not in too much of a hurry because this hotfix is going to be planned to go live on April 19th, so TLDR next reset, but still it's worth talking about now because it's a quite meaningful change. These are nerfs, and these nerfs are hitting the two strongest AOE specs at the moment. It's not often that we get such a precise nerf to the two strongest, to some of the strongest specs in the game, and this time around, however, Destruction Warlock and Survival Hunter have been hit by an AOE damage nerf. So just going in immediately, the nerf to Survival is that Wildfire Cluster, their legendary that they use, is now going to have its explosions damage reduced beyond 8 targets being hit. On a similar note, in beyond target hitting, Destruction Warlock gets a nerf to a talent. So not a legendary, not an ability, but a talent, which is Inferno. Inferno now has a reduced chance for Rain of Fire to generate Soul Shard fragments when it deals damage beyond 8 targets. This was primarily the problem with these two specs and the AOE damage they could dish out on more than just a couple of packs of mobs or multiple mobs altogether. They had far and away the most consistent AOE damage out of all specs, particularly Destruction Warlock. Destruction Warlock was a significant outlier, even more than Survival. To put things in perspective and trying to see what this nerf means for these specs and for the other specs that now can do more comparable damage to them, is going to look at a Mythic Plus key. We're going to take the dungeon where you can do the most consistent large group polls for massive AoE, which is Halls of Atonement. So when you look at Halls of Atonement, this is the damage of the top 10 warlocks in plus 23 keys of Halls of Atonement. You see, it's actually getting to the 30,000 DPS range for AoE. Now, what about other range DPS specs that you have come to know have some good AoE damage in your Mythic Plus groups? You must have seen specs like Frost Mage or specs like Marksmanship Hunter having good AoE DPS, right? So this is your Frost Mage in the same level of key of the Destruction Warlock, and instead of closing in on the 30,000 DPS range, Frost Mage is chilling in the 20,000 DPS range. What about Marksmanship Hunter? Marksmanship Hunter is also chilling, not even actually, in the 20,000 DPS range. This is the difference that a Destruction Warlock has, or by the time the nerf comes in, perhaps had, in AoE damage in Mythic Plus keys. You can also look, by comparison, to Survival Hunter. As I said, Survival is not as much of an outlier as Destruction, so it's not as dominant as their damage. So you can see here that in Halls of Atonement the Survival Hunter is getting to the more or less 22,000 DPS range, so it's still significantly lower than Destruction. But what about other melee DPS specs that you have seen doing well in AoE? You must have seen specs like Windwalker or specs like Frost, Death Knight being often used for having some quite good AoE. So when we look at Windwalker, you look at Halls of Atonement, the same key level, and Windwalker is in the 19,000-ish range of DPS, which is over 20% lower than a Survival Hunter. What about Frost Death Knight when it comes to Halls of Atonement? Well, Frost Death Knight is in the high 19,000, closing in the 20,000 average DPS range for the top logs. So both of the other two quite good AoE specs of DPS for melee were still not edging in on Survival, which was easily overperforming them. And they are towards the top. I haven't even gone and looked at specs like Assassination Rogue, specs like Outlaw, specs like Unholy, Feral, Retribution. These were just the upper tier of other melee DPS specs in Mythic Plus, and Survival was above them quite handily. Now, some people might think this is the end of Survival and this is the end of Destruction. What is worth pointing out, because, you know, some people might say they are nerfing their damage beyond 8 targets. So now their mega AoE gets nerfed, and that's what they were good at. Now that they can only do well in pools of 8 enemies and below, there are going to be other specs that can do that better. Well, you know what? Instead of Halls of Atonement, which is the key where you can make the most large pools, why don't we look at the opposite? Why don't we look at Theater of Pain, which is the dungeon where you can make the least large pools in trash mobs, in trash count. So when you look at Theater of Pain, the average damage of the top logs of destruction is around the 15,500 DPS. Jesus Christ, is half as much as Halls of Atonement. That's how little you get to pull in Theater of Pain. Perhaps this is the balance, right? Destruction was not even that strong in smaller pools. They were only stronger in big pools. That's why they got nerfed. Once we go back to the other strong AoE specs for ranged, we can see that in Theater of Pain, Frost Mage is not even in the upper 15,000 range. It's averaging 14,500 DPS in the top logs of Theater of Pain. When you look at the other range DPS spec, which is Marksmanship Hunter is also in the upper end of 14,000 DPS. So, even while looking at smaller groups, smaller packs of trash mobs, Destruction Warlock is still ahead of other very good range DPS specs when it comes to AoE. Of course, it's no longer gapping them by 70% more damage like the ridiculous numbers of Halls of Atonement. Now the better results of Destro are only 10, perhaps 15% better, but it's still doing better. What about Survival? Survival Hunter in a close quarter, small pool dungeon like Theater of Pain averages about 15,000 DPS range. It's varying a little bit between the 14.5 to the 17.9 outlier of the first log, but overall it's getting in the 15,000 range. If you look at Windwalker in Theater of Pain, it's in essentially high 13,000, 14,000, let's just round it up for Windwalker. And then Frost Death Knight. Frost Death Knight in Theater of Pain is averaging about 14,500. So, Survival, much like Destruction, is also still being quite well performing in Theater of Pain, even if they don't get to hit as many times more than 8 targets. You know, you can count pretty much on your fingers, on your hand, the amount of pulls in Theater of Pain where you're pulling more than 8 mobs. So we have been getting, essentially, this nerfed version of Destro and this nerfed version of Survival in a dungeon like Theater of Pain already, and they don't really seem to be weak, or at the very least weaker than other specs. I said Theater of Pain as an example, but there are a handful of other dungeons where you can see and you can even compare how the specs are doing. Dungeons like Spires of Ascension, for example, doesn't have too many 8+ mobs being pulled together. That's another dungeon where these specs are still doing better than their counterparts. So even with this nerf in mind, I don't think it's going to amount to anything other than making their wildly superior AoE now just being better. That's it. A balanced version of being better, and not the wildly more performing, better performing than what we have seen so far. The main culprit, just to go a little bit in depth if you have no idea how Destruction Warlock worked, the main culprit being Inferno is because this talent has no cap. This talent has no diminishing returns. This talent has no limit. Perhaps Blizzard forgot one thing. One very problematic thing. That thing is that Reign of Fire is multi-castable. It's recastable in the same place for multitudes of damage. Similar to Earthquake. The Earthquake of an Elemental Shaman that you can just reapply in the same spot over and over. You know, when you have Inferno and you get to generate more soul shards and you get to spend more of them into Reign of Fire, it's gonna look quite scary, because your Warlock is going to put down their Inferno, use their Trinket, pull down their Soul Rot, and thanks to the Cane Soul Satchel they get 20% crit, 20% haste. They lay down a handful of Immolates, put down the first Conflagrate, and then you get this. This is what you get. you get a barrage of overlapping rain of fires back to back to back to back for a lot of time and for a lot of DPS because of the amount of shards they get to generate, the amount of shards they get to spend into more rain of fires, which thanks to Inferno give you more chance to generate soul shards, which give you more casts of rain of fire. To put this even more under the microscope, these are roughly 75 seconds of this pool with Bloodlust, with your Inferno. 75 seconds, and a Destruction Warlock is generating a little bit over 160 soul shards. 160 soul shards in 75 seconds. You are pretty much generating 2 soul shards per second. That's the speed, the generation of soul shards that you are getting when you are essentially in this build. For survival, on the other hand, it's, as we have seen already from the numbers, it's not as powerful. It wasn't as broken as Destruction, but it still had some good synergy with their super powerful tier set. This is most of the reason why survival has grown so much in power, because of this thing right here. The power here lies where, you know, Wildfire Cluster is good damage. As a single legendary, being able to do 15% of your damage in Mythic Plus is quite good. It's actually in the top end of damage increases for a legendary. 15% is big. On top of this was the synergy with the fact that this scaled with all of the other Wildfire Bomb damage increases. So your talent, which increases your Wildfire Bomb damage by 100%, your tier set bonuses, which increase the damage of your Wildfire Bombs, all went on to affect Wildfire Cluster. And then there is the haste, the stacking continuous haste over time that you end up getting as a survival hunter, also thanks to Bloodseeker, giving you 10% haste per bleeding enemy. So per enemy that you hit with kill command in the last 8 seconds, you gain tons of haste. This generated a very powerful feedback loop. You know, technically speaking, kill command has a 6-second cooldown, and it has 2 charges, which means in a 15-second window with a 6-second cooldown and 2 charges, you should still only be able to cast 4 to 5 kill commands. The problem is you have haste. The problem is you get to cast way more of them than you should. So in this 15-second window, instead of casting 4 to 5 kill commands, you're casting 12 of them. And your 2-piece set bonus gives you a 40% chance every time you do to give you a free Wildfire Bomb. As another example, these are the Wildfire Bomb casts. This is a 14-second window. Wildfire Bomb has 2 charges with the talent and an 18-second recharge. So in this 14-second gap, you should only be able to cast 2 of them, maybe 3 of them, and the hunter is casting 6. This was the reason why all of these tiny little bits and pieces of talents, passives, and legendary effects forming the Exodia for the Survival Hunters AoE. So, with this nerf, to recap this short video about this set of nerfs, we will see eventually, we will likely get some simulations out quickly enough to see just how much of a nerf this is going to be. But for the moment, I just wanted to stress that even though they are getting nerfed because of their wide AoE damage, their uncapped AoE damage was very high, still they have still shown to be amongst the highest, if not the highest, AoE damage specs when it comes to smaller packs of enemies in those type of dungeons with lower amount of packs, like Theater of Pain, like Plagueful, like Spires of Ascension. So overall, I think it's a very good type, I would say, type of nerf. They were easily the 2 outliers when it came to AoE damage, so these nerfs are necessary. And I also like the manner in which these nerfs came, because they haven't nerfed their AoE. As far as you're not hitting more than 8 targets, their AoE hasn't been nerfed. So I do like this type of, you know, toning down of the power of AoE for these 2 specs. So for this emergency video of today, we can stop here. We have gone over this most recent surprising set of changes from Blizzard, so I will leave you now to your own conclusions about these nerfs. I'm sure some people will still think these nerfs are not enough. I'm certain of it. But I'm not gonna enter in a discussion for now. We will see eventually how they will end up doing after the hotfix nerfs next week, next reset. With this being said, thank you guys for watching the video and for helping to support the channel. You can contribute to the growth even more by liking and commenting on the video, as well as subscribing down below. Obviously, I don't want to be mean to all of the Survival Hunter and Destro Warlock players, so for today, only everyone else who doesn't play those two nerfed specs can subscribe. And then you can also find me over on Twitter right here, as well as you can support me on Patreon over here as well. With your monetary contribution, I am thinking about buying new blinds for my room. You know, perhaps a different color, not that depressing grey. You know, something different. Now, useless things aside, thank you guys for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, yeah, I still think it's gonna be not really changing too much the situation in Mythic Plus, honestly.